So a little bit about kind of the background of the paper and why I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk on it, present on it. Kind of represents the intersection of two or three areas of interest for me. One is, as you've heard, just phenomenology and hermeneutics. So there's some stuff that I got to revisit Gadamer in this paper. The other aspect of it, though, is Adventist studies. I'm trying to understand a little bit, I guess, historical studies, Adventism in its context. And then thirdly, kind of connected to the phenomenology and hermeneutics bit is explaining it in a way that makes sense to me and other people. Because as you work on it, you're like, why is this so hard to explain? So specifically in this paper, methodologically, what I'm trying to explore is how do you motivate or lead somebody through what phenomenologists call the reduction, okay? Or a bracketing of an identification and bracketing of assumptions that one has, and so help people see things in a new way. So I'm trying to do that, I guess, assuming an Adventist kind of audience. And so anyway, so that's the kind of method that I'm trying to work with in this paper. So I'd love to hear how it sounds and means to you. So in this paper, I'm differentiating between two accounts of reasoning, which I think inform two ways of interpreting the Bible and Scripture. One is broadly the empirical approach, empiricism, a la John Locke. And the other is what you could broadly call the phenomenological or hermeneutical approach, which in this paper, I'm focusing mainly on Gadamer, a little bit of Heidegger and the insights they have. And I'm really trying to contrast the two approaches. So in the first section of the paper, I kind of lay out, this is kind of the new stuff that I got to get into is John Locke and John Locke's views and John Locke's influence in 18th and 19th century America, specifically his epistemological views and his views on interpreting the Bible, which I'm trying to show are connected. Then I follow that by arguing that this is actually a view of reasoning that is contingent and can be contested and has been contested. And in doing so, I'm trying to set up kind of the alternative, the consideration of alternative, drawing out, which I think is preferable, phenomenological, hermeneutical, and I'm trying to draw out some basic insights for theology and hermeneutics. Okay, so we're all familiar with appeals to the plain reading of the Bible, right? I just read what is there, and usually, along with a plain reading, we're kind of committed to one reading, which is, my reading, right? And this view of how you approach the text, I'm trying to clarify, has an epistemology. It has a view of how you think reasoning works that is being implicitly and sometimes uncritically accepted, right? So this view has a history. And in the American context, and through that, the Adventist context, the person who articulates the epistemology behind this view, as well as the hermeneutic, is somebody named John Locke. His essay, the essay concerning human understanding, reinvigorates this ancient metaphor from Greek philosophy of the tabula rasa. He suggests that that's what the mind is. It's a white sheet of paper with nothing on it. And then he goes on to provide an account of how you have bits of data that come into the mind to form impressions on this blank slate and then become what he calls ideas. And ideas are then what the mind is reflecting on when it reasons. Now, on this model, aside from being blank, the mind is, by Locke, understood to be primarily passive. It receives these impressions from the world, and it can't actually, it has like almost no say-so. It just comes in. And I'm going to just read this quote, okay? These simple ideas, this is Locke, when offered to the mind, the understanding can no more refuse to have, nor alter when they are imprinted, nor blot them out and make new ones itself, than a mirror can review, alter, or obliterate the image or ideas which the object sets before it do therein produce. Now, that's a mouthful, I know, but here you have two metaphors combining. One is the blank slate, okay, and the other is the mirror. And the two kind of come together and form the image of the mind receiving and reflecting back sensations that it gets from an external reality in a very passive way. Now, these simple ideas that one receives and reflects become the basis for other ideas Locke calls complex ideas. And you can kind of combine these and come up with all kinds of things, some of them true and some of them a mix of true and false, okay, and just some of it just pure imagination. Now, this view informs in a certain attitude toward tradition. Tradition is a source of error because you get these simple ideas and you mix in stuff and you had a complex idea that you don't really know what's in there, okay? Is it true? Is it false? And so then rationality is the process that part of it is then not only combining simple ideas to form new ideas, but then breaking down complex ideas back down into back down into the original clear and distinct simple ideas, and kind of analyzing were these put together correctly, right? And so tradition then for Locke is an amalgam of confused ideas. And one of the goals of rational reflection is to break things down to the pure and pristine world of simple ideas, which can then be reconstituted correctly to form true ideas, complex ideas. Now, what's really interesting is that there is a correlation or a connection between this view of reasoning and actually a theory of how you should interpret the Bible. So Locke also wrote on that, which I did not know, right? So in this book, or this very famous influential paraphrase and notes on the Epistle of St. Paul, the introduction of it, which was reprinted many times after Locke's death, Locke repeatedly appeals to the plain and clear sense of Scripture, right? And he lays out a method for interpreting difficult passages that are prone to misinterpretation. And the goal of this method is to recover, and I'm quoting here a scholar who explains this, is to recover the singular sense of the author by a careful and comparative mode of reading. Okay, so the scriptures contain complex ideas. And so just like you do with other ideas, you got to break those down and you got to analyze them and you have to reconstitute them, all right? So Locke has very sound principles of biblical exegesis that he provides in this essay. You should read text in context, right? You should avoid imposing your assumptions onto the text, right? And he says, like, when you encounter something in Paul that you don't understand, you should take that phrase or that word, and you should look up other instances where the apostle uses those words and try to get at the original sense, and then just assume there's going to be consistency, right? And then you can derive through this method what Paul meant, okay? And then Locke claims, once you apply this method, right, the apostles' quote meaning is very easy and intelligible. And once again, the obscure becomes plain, okay? Now, this essay has this very, very interesting quote. I'm going to read it to you if you want to follow along on page 4. Okay, the goal of this method is the reduplication of the author's ideas into one's own mind. Okay, this is what Locke says. Until we, from his words, paint his very ideas and thoughts in our minds, we do not understand. Okay, so blank slates, mirrors, and now, I guess, rooms that need whitewashing. Okay, and the goal of then is, reading the Bible is to kind of paint your mind with what Paul is thinking. Now, what's really remarkable is when you look into the histories, how influential and popular Locke's views on these matters were, right? Locke's book on the essay concerning human understanding, for many years was the sole textbook assigned at colleges, the leading colleges in New England, right? Take a philosophy class, you're going to read John Locke's. So this shaped, obviously, then a generation of thought leaders, including clergy, okay? His paraphrase, or the introduction to the paraphrase, gained him a reputation as a master biblical exegete. This, after he died, the essay was reprinted 8 times, right? And he was just considered a genius in this area as well, right? Groups reacting to reformology in New England found commonality with Locke, because Locke also rejected mortality of the soul, and he rejected double predestination. So Adventist leaders like D.M. Canwright praised Locke as that great Christian philosopher, and then even quoted approvingly from his other book, The Reasonableness of Christianity. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is not that early Adventist leaders were reading Locke directly, although I think probably some of them were, if they went to any of these institutions. But it's very clear that they were aware and appreciative of some aspects of Locke's thought, and they were writing and thinking in a social context where Locke's views formed an influential part of the cultural encyclopedia. Locke's method of biblical interpretation, informed by his view of reason, informed early Adventist approaches to biblical interpretation, and I would suggest, or I would claim, or maybe argue, that many Adventists today continue to interpret Scripture in like manner, unaware of the view of reason that they are assuming and affirming. So that's the epistemology of the plain reading. So I would like to contrast that with what I call an epistemology of plural readings. So once we realize that these are Locke's views, right? They're his views of reasoning. we can recognize that, hey, this is an option for people. It's not the default or only way you can think of reason. So this is where the suspension comes in. Once you realize that's what's going on, you can identify it and maybe take a step back from it, take a different attitude toward this view. Rather than tacitly accepting it, consider alternatives or what things might look like if you weren't assuming that. All right, so here are some key aspects of Locke's view of reason that I've just gone over. The mind in its most basic state is blank, okay? The mind is passive. It receives individual impressions. And then thirdly, it reflects back those things, right? Which then form other kinds of ideas. So these three assumptions, along with other features which won't have time to come over, have been the subject of sustained critique by numerous thinkers, right? So the view that emerges as you critique these elements of this view of reason is that rather than thinking of the mind as blank, receptive, and reflective, okay, the mind is conceived of by thinkers like Heidegger and Gadamer as always and already aware or prejudiced. I'll explain that word in a little bit. Secondly, always or active in co-constituting experience and meaning. And thirdly, historically situated and affective in fundamental ways. Okay, so then you get the shift, that's the title of my paper, from thinking of the mind as a flat slate to something that is dynamic or circular in structure. Okay, so Gadamer, Heidegger, following Heidegger, really plays or develops this notion of the hermeneutical circle. This is the idea that reasoning, in the way that it is structured, has a fore structure, which means before we think about anything, we're already and always engaging in activities that kind of project, anticipate, have goals, right? And all of these things shape the way our awareness is of reality. And then, so in some ways, we're interpreting at a very fundamental level reality, or what Heidegger calls being. Okay, and then it's from that context we're also then rationally thinking about this. Okay, so our rational thought is something that is being conditioned or being done in the context of this this background awareness, which is an interpretation. Okay, so for Heidegger, he just says, "Hey, look, I'm not saying making a claim about this being bad or good. It's just the way reason works if you think about it, right? And so the goal then is not to escape this, which is to try to escape the human condition." But it's something that you should try to be aware of and acknowledge, and then try to constructively navigate. Okay, so Gadamer takes these kinds of insights about the hermeneutical circle and he applies them to the interpretation of Scripture, right? And so he says that all textual interpretation is shaped by prejudgments and expectations. He calls these prejudices. Okay, we bring these to the text. If we did not have them, we would not be looking at the text at all. Okay, we always approach the text with anticipating something we're going to try to get from. It's an initial meaning. It's you're anticipating some answer. Okay, you're asking the question. Okay, and this is just the ontological structure of understanding, according to Gadamer, right? And so once you see what the structure of reasoning is, you can become more self-aware of what is happening as you're trying to understand the text. Now, many people misunderstand Gadamer to mean by this that, well, are you saying that anything goes and you can make a text say whatever you want? It's very clear that is not what Gadamer means, right? He follows Heidegger on this. It's like the goal is always to try to get to the thing itself that you're trying to understand, right? And it's as you're aware of what you're doing, right? Suspending a little bit some of the assumptions you're bringing and trying to get clear on them. You're all asking the question: is assumption I'm bringing distorting what I'm trying to understand? Or helping me understand it better. Okay, and according to both thinkers, you can suspend and even shift the assumptions that you have in order to understand a text or a given aspect of reality in a more accurate way, in a fuller way. So Merrill Westphal, one of my mentors, he provides an example of Gadamer's view on reasoning and interpretation from the world of performing arts. He writes, "If I am performing Hamlet, I am not free to say to fish or not to fish, instead of to be or not to be, nor am I free to play an A flat every time the score of the Hammer Clavichord Sonata calls for a C sharp." Okay? So good interpretation, according to Gadamer, was always submit to the constraints provided by the script, the score, text. Projecting your own prejudices onto a text doesn't work in the long run because the text ceases to make sense, right? And so you are pulled short by the text. And so the goal is always, hey, I'm trying to understand this. I'm doing this with awareness of what and then I'm approaching with a willingness to suspend and shift the assumptions that I have. Now, with that said, the other move that Gadamer makes is one that some people who really like Locke are disturbed by, because Locke says it's not anything though, it's not all relative, but he says there are a plurality of legitimate meanings that cannot be eliminated. Right? So I'll just read the quote here, footnote 24, very rich quote. The real meaning of a text as it speaks to the interpreter does not depend on the contingencies of the author and his original audience. It certainly is not identical with them, for it is always co-determined, also by the historical author. That is why I think is not merely a reproductive, but always right. So meaning is always co-determined by text, reader. Okay, this means plain reading the text because every reader is an interpretation. Every reader interprets from within the hermeneutical circle. New meanings emerge as different interpreters from different times and places engage the same text. So, basic constraint like text or give legitimate meanings, right? So different humans who are all historical and finite, living in different times, places with different concerns, approach text with those factors conditioning them. So they cannot step out of their finitude or their place in history. Okay, so your prejudices can be modified, but they can never be eliminated. So this is a chart that in some earlier I put up trying to illustrate what I think Gadamer's get at, right? Fusion of horizon, which is the meaning, the reader, because you have different coming from different points in history, you have the meaning that has emerged are similar, and that's where you can. Okay, that is just what. Let's see. Okay. So to design rid of the situation or extricate oneself from the situation is a prejudice against prejudice. Gadamer says, and this is a prejudice that comes from history. It's from it. So seek that or just tradition. And I think the point I want to kind of draw on here or emphasize is that the hermeneutical view of reason comes from Heidegger. Okay? And Heidegger was influenced by his engagement with Schleiermacher in developing this view, who we know is a Christian theologian. Okay, and as a young philosopher, he was actually, as he was working up the ideas that led up to being in time, he was reading very seriously Pascal, Martin Luther, and Soren Kierkegaard. This led him to Augustine and eventually the Apostle Paul. And he basically was teaching at one point a course in the New Testament. Okay, and the goal in him trying to do that was he's trying to discover the original, he called category engaging being in time. They liked it so much. He writes, they found themselves staring at their own image. Hermeneutical thing is it comes from, right? Whereas I think the blank slate view is Stoic and Aristotelian, which they're great too, but it's just not as clearly Christian. All right, then I also think the hermeneutical view aligns well with the key theological affirmations of creatureliness and finitude. So as humans, we are created in space and time. We are not God. And then in affirming that, we can also form an elevated view of Scripture. Scripture is a text that is rich enough to require a multi-minute, because, we want the blank slate single meaning. Okay, so no one interpretation can exhaust scripture. We encounter in what God reveals an overflow of meaning. Okay, so anyway, that's just kind of the paper. So I think we're at time, so I will stop here and we can go back to points if you want to revisit.
Here. So please state your name, and also I do wonder if for the participants who are online, would it be helpful, maybe we can ask, maybe they can communicate with us, if you come to the front so they can also see you, and that would also enable you to be. Oh, okay, then I guess we'll go back and forth.
We can turn over the camera.
I don't know who was first. I saw, let's go with these three first. Four.
Okay. So, thanks. Obviously, I would like your paper. So I have another view that can support the view you're presenting. It's the rabbinic view. It's the way the text was read by the original people of the text, people of the book. There's a Talmudic story which says that the Bible is like wheat and flax, which we ought to bake into bread and weave into a tablecloth. And God prefers the final product than the raw, undigested product. So there was the idea of interpretation is necessary. We have to, we matter, right, in the formation of meaning of the text. So my question is, so you say, okay, we have to as readers, we are kind of how do you say, thrown into a reality, right? All this is informing our interpretation. We have to kind of suspend it to get to the text. But should we not also, is not the text also itself rooted in a culture, in a worldview? And are we not also, should we not also try to wrest meaning out of that culture? Is there not also suspension that we have to do for the text, right? The text also should get rid of its prejudices as we're trying to. So we usually get rid of our prejudices. You know what I mean? What does Gadamer say about the text having to get rid of its prejudices, or we having to sift from the text the prejudices of the patriarchal culture or whatever, and the actual meaning, right?
Yeah. So I wanted to do the first, respond back to the first part of your comment, which I think is easier. If I understand correctly, in rabbinic theology, plurality of interpretations, which is different in rabbinic schools, is not a problem. So you can have rabbis get together and disagree about the text, and everybody's still Jewish, right? And so there's something other than agreement that is holding the Jewish identity and community together, and it's an acknowledgement of, I think, this reality, this plurality.
Yeah, it's the
Right.
that's holding us.
Yeah.
External meaning.
So I think that is a kind of a similar practical implication of what I think the Gadamer view is. The other view, this is where I'm not really entirely sure exactly what Gadamer would say this, because I think he does classify scripture as a different kind of, like, he seems to, I think, kind of have more of a Barthian view of the Bible, like you encounter God in the preaching of it. So I'm not sure if he would apply his general kind of textual hermeneutics to the Bible, but I think I don't know if he ever gets into this idea of, like, can you identify the prejudices of the author themselves, and how much of that is a projection of the reader. I think he kind of speaks of the text itself as coming to the reader from a different time and place, representing a tradition that the reader should take seriously as a viewpoint that they're trying to sympathetically understand, rather than just reject as something that is false or unimportant. So it's like,
I guess I'm thinking,
yeah,
perhaps, but he doesn't mention that.
Yeah, so I mean, the other concept people critique him for this is, like, he doesn't talk about, like, rejecting views that are, for him, it's a fusion of horizons. And I think what he means by that, it's a metaphor, is that what happens when I encounter a view or a tradition that is different from my own, the goal is not, oh, your view is false and mine is true. It's the idea is that you and your view, even if I am standing in the same place, right? The way I am, that's my understanding of the fusion of horizons. So I think that's how he might encounter, he might respond to, maybe trying to understand the biblical world, if we were to apply it. Yeah.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Lara, and I'm not a philosopher, but I really enjoy listening to you. And so I think you can explain for me very nicely why that process of and they both work for me.
All right, yeah.
Gutierrez, Jim, and for now.
I am a resident of I work back to the information and maybe to add a relational hermeneutic to that because I find it interesting like symbolic conversion is going meaning making and you talked about meaning you talked about between us and I think that maybe if we try to remove that personal bias that become like actually doing damage the view
What I'm saying is there's a whole thing where it kind of talks about the pre-understanding. I try to talk quickly, but the pre-understanding before we start thinking about rationally or explicitly. I think interesting what we're talking about, but we're not awareness out of each other that should guide our reasoning when we start reasoning about ethics or other things. We kind of ignore that and we try to act as if the ideas are what mediate us to other people, whereas the relationships we are in kind of are more fundamental than what we're actually thinking and is that Charles Taylor does this. He comments on Gadamer, and I footnote him in the essay, but he talks about the fusion of horizons, not just between the reader and the text, but between the different readers of the same text. And that there's a way that you can fuse horizons kind of horizontally amongst readers, right? And kind of approach it and say, hey, I don't see it the same way as you do, but I think I understand where you're coming from, what your concerns are, why you're saying these things. And then my interpretation now relationally includes the other reader acknowledging that they also have a legitimate claim to the meaning of the text.
Thank you, Zane. This interesting confrontation between brain breathing and Buddhism and live breathing. So,
Would you mind introducing yourself first? Thank you.
Hans Gutierrez. To go to the epistemological level that often is ignored and removed. Epistemological level helps us understand better what our intellectual positions are. In a very resurrected. The position that is completely against me. And in the other side, Gadamer is, very beneficial, but and Heidegger mentioned introducing a kind of pre-Buddhism because we are not just a blank just rooted and large and bring out business and cultural statements, pre-understanding, and that differentiate what is prejudice. The critic of recur to that is that Heidegger and Gadamer just overlook too much the critical instance, because you need also to pay a lot of attention to that. Just only again black and white, but for the rest, all your thoughts are welcome.
Yeah, so I for those of you who are about if you look at the footnotes, some of the essays that were written, making this connection, interpretation or this explanation that you and what he actually says. Like he uses the word plain and simple a lot in his writings, right? And so by that, I don't think he means like it just the text is what I immediately think it says it means. He doesn't mean that, but he thinks you can get to it. So that's why he's got his method, which is you do the break down the complex ideas, you compare similar readings or similar statements in other parts of the Bible, and so he has a method where he thinks he can decomplexify and distill it down to the simple and the point, right? And I think that's the intent. So I do want to be clear. He's not just saying, oh, I'm just reading the plain meaning. This he admits the Bible is complicated. We're all into the text method, and then we could break it down to the simple and the point. This is how I understand what Locke's project is. So let me see. The other question that you were asking was, oh, the two views, either or. So I didn't have time to develop this as a paper, but I do think there's a way you can try to make it a both and the question just becomes which mode of reasoning is really the most fundamental and basic. So I think that if you kind of going to favor Locke, you could say, well, Locke is onto something, and these other modes of interpretation we do is, yeah, you can do that with the reasoning, but like the goal of philosophy is to boil it back down to the simplest parts and put it together. So it's like an atomism and Anglo-American philosophy, I think, some versions of it, right? But I think the other view is that what Locke is trying to articulate is itself derivative. That way of engaging the world and thinking about it is derivative from kind of this more basic interpretive awareness, right? And so I think you can try to reconcile the two, but then you're going to get into kind of like, you're going to have to choose which one is more fundamental. And I think you're still going to get like either a Lockean view at the end or kind of a fundamentally hermeneutical view.
Good. We still have 8 minutes.
Okay.
So we have one question.
I'm going to talk slower.
And maybe a third one if there is time.
Okay, I'm Jim Walters from Loma Linda, and I am looking at your last section where you say that the Lockean epistemology and hermeneutics is not necessarily the, and you put that in italics, the Adventist epistemology and hermeneutics. But don't we have a challenge in Adventism? Because it's becoming increasingly clear that the pioneers had a very literalistic, some would say fundamentalistic view of Scripture, very Lockean. And then when we formalized Adventist theology, that became more entrenched. And then in the 20s, as Michael Campbell has pointed out, we put aside the live discussion of Ellen White's hermeneutics with the 1919 Bible Conference materials, and a very plain reading of Scripture set in and is now dominant in Adventism around the world. And we're a minority of a minority of a minority, those of us in this room. And so what you are saying here is not going to make it to general population. And one of the things I, as an ethicist, am grappling with is the ethical challenge of what to do with the new material we're finding out about Ellen White's humanity and what that means for our paradigm of truth. Do you have any reflections?
I think it's two parts. One is Ellen White, and the other is the connection of all this to fundamentalisms. There's a very interesting essay, footnote number 6. This scholar I found named Peter Scholes. He's got a really interesting book called The Imposition of Method that I'm drawing on. But there's this essay that he writes that he tries to connect John Locke's views on these matters and the rise of fundamentalism more generally in the West. So he tries to argue that it is Lockean epistemology and hermeneutics that is the intellectual bedrock of fundamentalism. And so I think that it's interesting. So in Adventism, yeah, and this is where historians, please nuance my reading further. You do get Lockean views that are very popular in 19th century America, right? And then you have a certain kind of epistemological DNA being set, a hermeneutical DNA being set. And then I think you can say that there's probably parallel movements in other Christian communities that are also on that path, right? So you could be on the liberal path, or you could be on the more conservative path. But then, like, yeah, when you have like the 1920s and what Michael is talking about, you basically have like this DNA lining up with this other movement that's maybe developed in a parallel path and kind of like merging. And at that point, then you just kind of cement the DNA as like the default view that is quote unquote our tradition's view on these things. So this is where I think like this genealogical work is really, really helpful, because if this is plausible or true, then like now we're like, okay, well, so are we really Lockeans? Like Adventists are Lockean empiricists? To me, that seems like, well, there's got to be more options than that, right? And so just the awareness that like that's what's going on helps us to be more self-aware as a tradition. If we're going to proceed in that path, yeah, like know that that's what we're doing, right? But it also helps us to then kind of hit pause and say, well, maybe that's not the only or best way. Maybe that way of approaching scripture is distorting what the scripture is trying to say, or how complex it really, really is. And then maybe consider other ways of approaching the text to see if like other insights emerge, right? And that's where like I think this idea of suspension is so helpful, because it's not denying that we've been influenced by Locke. We can't. That's our history, right? But can we suspend, expand, and maybe shift? Is the question. Now, I would say all these issues also apply with Ellen White. So just replace scripture with like what you think you're doing with Ellen White. You get like people saying, "I'm just reading what she said," right? And they don't realize there's a lot of selection going on. There's a lot of why are you interested in that book rather than this book? Okay, why this sentence rather than that sentence? Okay, why this interpretation rather than this other interpretation? And so people who are like committed to like this framework and not aware, they're just like, I don't even understand why you disagree with me, because it's so obvious, like what she says here, right? Anyways, I think the hermeneutical circle applies to all forms of interpretation, including Ellen White.
Okay, we are going to take 5 more minutes for this. So Dr. Miller, and then we have a question online, and then we'll wrap up for this morning.
Sure.
Thank you for this, Zane. The dialogue.
Another version of that conversation.
Either or framework. And, you know, I agree with what Bonnie said, that there's a fusion of horizons possible here, I think, with Locke and what's going on. And I think one of the keys may be, Locke says plain a lot, plain and obvious. But I'm not certain about this. I'm quite sure in terms of Ellen White. Ellen White doesn't say plain reading, but he says plain meaning. You were quoting a Locke, he uses plain sense, which is more like plain meaning.
Okay.
What's the distinction there? The plain reading does walk into a kind of naive realism that I don't think Locke is guilty of. And I resonate with what Locke said, that Locke would not recognize himself in the way that he's been characterized here. The book that I have, The Liberated Judgment.
Liberated Judgment, okay.
Skeptics and John Locke, Politics of Probability by W. Castle.
Yeah.
And he says that Locke, in his interpretation, in fact, his view of the subjectivity of judgment is the foundation of his notion of tolerance and religious freedom, right? And so there's a lot going on here at the individual level that needs to take place. it's moving away from what I would argue is the sort of Catholic middle-aged fundamentalist naive realism that serves as the basis for persecution. Now, Locke was mediated in good part through Adventism by Reid and the Scottish Common Sense Enlightenment. And if you read Mark Knoll and others, there is a kind of naive realism strand of that that comes into the 19th century. But Adventism, unlike fundamentalists, holds on to this more very subjective Lockean perspective that I think deserves greater regard and greater attention, and probably does have consilience with the hermeneutical spiral that you're talking about. I think if things are communicated in this way, that the German thinkers are perhaps elaborating on some of the lost insights rather than this is a war between the two camps, that the grand compiled Adventists are more likely to listen to.
So thank you, Nick. I know I need to probably nuance my reading on Locke more. I actually was at some point wanting to engage. I know that the essay you actually wrote on common sense realism tradition and foundationalism. I feel like what I was trying to address in this essay was more fundamental than that, because I think what like foundationalism and this language of probability does is kind of assumes that there's like this data that humans have that are like fairly neutral, and then they just have to be put together correctly, or correct judgments have to be made about these ideas. And then some judgments are more probably or more sound when it comes to a statistical standpoint than others. I feel like the issues that we're talking about here is kind of trying to say, well, we're not even talking about the interpretation of the data and how you put it together. We're talking about what appears to you at the ground level, right? And I think what you get in Locke is the idea is that it is possible, or the most fundamental aspect of what reasoning gets us is the level of simple ideas, which represents and reflects reality, right? So to me, that is like claims. The mind is a blank slate that receives impressions that it doesn't do anything with, that it's passively mirroring back. Then reasoning then comes along and then puts it together in different ways, makes it complex or makes judgments about how these things are connected. And then you get problems with like skepticism and all this kind of stuff. So I kind of feel like some of the stuff you're addressing is kind of talking about reasoning at that level, whereas what I'm kind of trying to address in this paper is like this idea that the base core of reason, there's this like neutral reflective layer that is fairly passive. That's what I think the hermeneutical view is resisting. It's saying that there is no kind of access like that to reality. Right?
Okay, we've got 1 minute for one question and a quick answer.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to read the online question from David Barrett. What do you think about the importance of play in hermeneutics? It seems to me that part of the process is exploring different perspectives through a process of imagination and creativity. Some of those perspectives may be unhelpful, but there is play in finding them, as opposed to the serious plain reading approach, which would militate against play, against imagination and creativity. So do you have anything to say about play?
I think there's a section in Truth and Method that's on it. I'm not familiar with that part of it. I'll just say this. I think Gadamer in Truth and Method is basically arguing that truth goes beyond method. So any appeal to trying to secure truth and reduce it to the method you are using is a prejudice of the Enlightenment. And so I think he would say, yeah, like the meaning of the text emerges in ways of relating to it that go beyond method, and we should be open to that. Is my kind of
Thank you. Thank you.